Largo, Florida, 5 a.m. A quiet neighborhood is shattered by a rhythmic, desperate pounding on a wooden door. A woman stumbles out of bed, only to find her neighbor standing on the porch, drenched from head to toe in deep, visceral red. Her throat had been carved open. Before she can utter a single syllable, she collapses a ghost before she's even dead. Welcome back. If you have a hunger for the stories the world tries to bury, the strange, the dark, and the mysterious, you've found your home. Today's case is a masterclass in premeditated shadow play. Before we descend into the darkness, do me a favor. If the like button is looking a little too comfortable, wake it up with a leaf blower. Let's get into it.
On an early morning in December 1991, a woman living in Largo, Florida, was jolted awake by the sound of frantic pounding on her front door. As she climbed out of bed, she realized it wasn't just knocking, someone was out there screaming for help. Realizing this was a crisis, she rushed to the door and flung it open. Standing on her porch was her neighbor, covered head to toe in blood. Her head was gashed, her throat clearly slit. But before the woman could even ask what happened, her neighbor collapsed onto the ground and passed out. But before we dive into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious told through captivating storytelling, you've come to the right place. We upload new videos 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that sounds like your kind of content, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Now let's get into it. On the evening of December 14th, 1991, 31-year-old Keith Young grabbed his car keys from a hook by the front door of his home in Largo, Florida. Behind him, his wife Anita slipped on her favorite pair of heels. The newlyweds were heading out for a long overdue date night. Both had been married before, and together they had 6 children from their previous relationships. Finding time alone was rare, but that night, Keith's kids were with their mother. Anita's 8-year-old daughter was at a sleepover, and her 12-year-old son, Jason, had agreed to babysit his younger siblings while the adults went out for dinner. Before leaving, Keith gave Jason a final rundown of expectations. Don't make too much of a mess. Keep everyone safe. And if there's a real emergency, call 911. He'd even written the restaurant's number on a notepad in the kitchen, just in case. Jason, with the confidence of a typical 12-year-old, rolled his eyes and said, "Yeah, I got it. It's under control." Keith knew he might be overthinking things, but there had been an attempted break-in at their house earlier that year, and he'd been on edge ever since. The intruder had cut their phone lines, removed a window screen, and tried to break down a door before fleeing without stealing anything. The suspect was never caught, leaving the family with an unsettling feeling that lingered. Keith and Anita hugged Jason goodbye and walked out the door. Keith double-checked the lock behind him. Less than 30 minutes later, they were seated at a restaurant, napkins unfolded, ready to enjoy a rare moment of peace. They'd met at a support group for single parents and married earlier that year, grateful to have found each other after difficult previous marriages. Anita's ex-husband, Luther Bass, had a violent temper and lived across the country in Idaho. Yet he still managed to complicate her life. That summer, he'd driven all the way to their house with a camper, his new girlfriend and her kids, planning to take his children on vacation. Anita had agreed initially, but when she saw the situation, she grew uneasy, fearing he might take the kids and not return. A heated argument erupted, and Anita threatened to call the police before Luther finally backed off. Meanwhile, Keith had his own battles with his ex-wife, Linda, over custody arrangements. Things had become so tense that Linda had begun harassing Anita over the phone and was preparing to take Keith to court. Despite all this, Keith felt lucky to have Anita. He was glad to care for her and her kids the way they deserved. So he kept the mood light and they enjoyed a nice dinner. When the check arrived, Keith glanced at his watch. It was getting late. He trusted Jason, but he's still worried about leaving the kids alone too long. He paid quickly and they drove home. When they arrived, Keith was relieved to find the kids calmly watching TV, the family cat curled up beside them. He told them it was time for bed, hugged Jason proudly, and helped Anita tuck the little ones in. Then he headed down the hall, kissed his wife goodnight, and turned off the light. Several hours later, around 3 a.m., Jason woke to a loud noise. He sat up in bed listening. Thumping came from the next room, then a scream. Still groggy, he slid down from the top bunk, crept to the door, and cracked it open. In the dark hallway, he could make out 2 shadowy figures struggling. One was his stepdad, Keith. The other was a large man in a black ski mask. Jason froze. Blood was sprayed across the walls. Then he saw the glint of a knife. At that moment, Anita burst from the master bedroom, covered in blood, wielding a baseball bat. She swung at the intruder, hitting him in the back of the head, but he barely flinched. Keith shouted for her to get the gun. Anita ran. Jason watched, paralyzed, as the intruder grabbed Keith and hurled him back into the bedroom. Then Anita appeared in the hallway with a gun, and the intruder fled out the front door. Jason snapped out of his shock and ran to the kitchen phone. He dialed 911 but heard only silence. The line was dead. He turned to see his mother staggering toward him, blood dripping from her neck. When he told her the phone was dead, she instructed him to go back to Keith and wait. She would find out. Jason walked down the hall and into the bedroom, where Keith lay on the bed, struggling to breathe. The 12-year-old knelt beside him, took his hand, and held it as Keith took his final raspy breaths. Hours later, before dawn on December 15th, 1991, Detective Mike Short of the Largo Police Department pulled up to a modest single-story home wrapped in crime scene tape. His supervisor had given few details, just that an intruder had attacked a husband and wife while they slept. Short found it odd. A quiet neighborhood wasn't known for violent home invasions. A uniformed officer briefed him. Anita had run to a neighbor's house before collapsing from blood loss. Keith was dead in the bedroom. Their 12-year-old son had witnessed the attack and was now at the neighbor's house. Anita was hospitalized with critical injuries. As Short walked up the driveway, he noticed blood on the cement. The front door was open, and inside lay a bloody baseball bat. Blood was smeared everywhere at walls, doors, furniture, as if of a violent struggle had raged through the entire house. It looked chaotic, unplanned. Short initially assumed this was a robbery gone wrong. He followed the blood trail down the hall, past a cat that darted under the couch, and into the master bedroom. Keith's body lay on the bed, his shirt shredded. Short looked at the severed lines and thought, that's too strange to be a coincidence. Back at the station, Short reviewed reports. 5 detectives had been assigned, and they'd gathered background on the victims. Neighbors described Keith and Anita as a normal, happy couple. Keith was an HVAC technician. Anita, a stay-at-home mom who did occasional accounting. But interviews also revealed both had ex-spouses with potential motives. Anita's ex-husband, Luther, lived in Boise, Idaho, far away, but not impossible to travel. Short called Boise police to track him down. Keith's ex-wife, Linda, lived locally. Keith's 2 kids were with her, unaware their father was dead. Since Linda and her new husband, Steve, were potential suspects, Short decided to break the news himself and observe their reactions. He drove to Linda's house, knocked, and was let inside. The home smelled of bacon and eggs, a normal Sunday morning. Linda seemed confused but invited him in. Steve was in the living room with the kids. Short asked Steve to join them in the kitchen. When he told them Keith was dead, Linda collapsed into Steve's arms. After a moment, Short asked where they'd been at 3 a.m. Linda, shocked at being considered a suspect, said they'd been home asleep with the kids. Steve nodded. Their alibi was weak on leading each other to vouch for them, but their reactions seemed genuine. Linda admitted her relationship with Keith was contentious and that she'd recently consulted a lawyer about custody. Short found the time inconvenient but thanked them and left. Late that night, Short's phone rang. Boise police had located Luther. He wasn't home when they arrived, but his fiancée Connie said he was on a hunting trip. Officers searched the area and finally caught up with him that evening. Luther claimed he'd been elk hunting alone about an hour from Boise, describing every detail, but no one could corroborate it. The drive from Boise to Largo took 3 or 4 days, so Luther couldn't have driven. But flying was possible. Short asked Boise police to check for airline tickets and to collect DNA samples. Short now had 3 suspects, Linda, Steve, and Luther. But there was a problem. Anita and Jason both described a dark-skinned man. Anita didn't recognize her description that fit none of them. Short knew eyewitness accounts could be unreliable. Jason might have been wrong. Anita was barely conscious, but if accurate, it could mean this was a random robbery after Elora. That one suspect had hired someone. The next morning, Short got a break. A groundskeeper at a nearby golf course had found a ski mask and glove in the grass. Short rushed over, noting the ponds and a lake across the street, possible places the killer might have dumped a weapon. The mask was crusted with what looked like dried blood. He sent it to the lab. Then he spoke with a college student who lived near the Youngs. The student said he and friends had seen a white man with short, dark hair jogging down Coronet Avenue, the exact route from the Youngs' house to the golf course around the time of the murder. This contradicted Jason's description, suggesting either Jason was wrong or there were 2 killers. A week later, Short received a report from Northport, Florida, where a man and 3 children had been shot to death in their home. 4 days after Keith's murder, the killers wore ski masks and had cut the phone lines. The similarities were striking, but the victims had no connection to the Youngs, and the method, shooting versus stabbing, differed. Short still felt the Youngs' attack was deeply personal. In January 1992, Short got a call from the lab. The hair found in the ski mask didn't match Luther. Disappointed but not ready to rule him out entirely, Short shifted focus. Weeks later, he visited Linda again. This time she seemed anxious. Finally, she revealed something she'd withheld. After marrying Steve, she'd briefly rekindled her relationship with Keith when Steve found out. He was furious and had even joked about hurting Keith. She'd checked his knife collection afterward, none were missing. Short was stunned. He brought both in for polygraphs, but the results weren't conclusive, and no hard evidence tied them to the crime. By March 1992, the investigation had gone cold. The task force had shrunk from 5 detectives to 2. Short feared Keith's murder might never be solved. Then his phone rang. A caller had information about the earlier break-in. As Short listened, everything clicked, based on evidence and a partial confession. Here's what investigators believe happened. Around 3 a.m. on December
15/1991,
the killer approached the dark house, cut the phone lines just like months before, and broke in. He carried an axe and a knife. The family cat hissed, but he soothed it, wanting minimal collateral damage. He entered the master bedroom and stood over Anita. She stirred, locked eyes with him, and screamed. Keith woke and fought back. The struggle spilled into the hall. Anita grabbed a baseball bat and swung, but the killer barely slowed. Keith shouted for her to get the gun. The killer saw Jason watching from a doorway and made a split-second decision. He threw Keith into the bedroom and fled. Outside, he removed his mask and jogged calmly down the street, hoping to look like an early morning runner. At the golf course, he changed clothes, stole a bike, and rode away. Things hadn't gone as planned, but he'd avoided hurting the kids or the cat. That mattered because the killer was Anita's ex-husband, Luther Bass. He wanted Anita out of the way to gain custody of their 4 children. Believing they needed him, Luther's fiancée, Connie, eventually told Boise police about the earlier break-in and revealed that Luther had flown to Florida that weekend using a fake name and social security number obtained from a co-worker. There was no second killer. Jason had been wrong about the skin color, Anita about not recognizing him. The hair in the mask, likely from someone else who'd worn it. Luther Bass was arrested in Boise on March 6, 1992, and confessed that same day. A year later, he was convicted of first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, and burglary with assault. He received life plus 30 years in prison. Anita survived and eventually recovered from her injuries. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and check out our playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge. Until next time, see ya.